Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the place where we stand in the footprints of the dreamers and the broken, the kings and the common folk, the boom years and the bust years that carved scars across the face of the world. Tonight, pour yourself something warm, maybe black coffee in a chipped enamel cup, because tonight we slip back not to a palace or a battlefield, but to breadlines and dust storms, to desperate farmers and anxious bankers, to a decade that taught the modern world just how fragile dreams can be. This is the story of the Great Depression, a story not of a single hero or villain, but of millions. Ordinary families whose childhoods were defined by want and worry, parents who did what they could with what little they had, presidents who rose and fell on promises to heal a wounded economy, and a generation whose scars would shape what they built when the storm finally lifted. How did it happen? What broke? What courage kept people alive when the banks shut their doors and the soil turned to dust? And why, in an age when we think we've learned our lessons, does the Great Depression still whisper warnings to us today? Sit back, pull that old blanket closer, and come with me into the soup kitchens and shuttered factories, the migrant camps and marble boardrooms to see how a broken world found ways to bend but not break. Before the breadlines, before the dust storms, there were bright lights, brass bands, and a nation strutting into modernity like it would never trip. The Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, a time when the world, weary from the Great War's trenches, threw open its doors to flappers, phonographs, and shiny new Fords rolling off Henry Ford's line faster than any horse could run. In cities, skyscrapers stabbed at the clouds, steel and ambition climbing higher every season. In small towns, the radio brought jazz and baseball crackling through the static. Children born in these years, sons named Joe and daughters named Betty, grew up thinking the future would always roar forward like a Model T on an open road. These children of the boom years knew a world humming with promise. Their fathers came home from the war dreaming of better days. Their mothers clipped recipes from glossy magazines, cooked on shiny new stoves bought on credit. Families bought fridges, toasters, even stocks, whether they had the money or not. Buy now, pay later, the American way. In cities like New York and Chicago, fortunes were made overnight. A young clerk might pour his paycheck into the stock market in the morning and call himself an investor by sunset. Stocks only went up until they didn't. Farmers out in Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Dakotas plowed the earth deeper than ever before, feeding cities that seemed endlessly hungry. Wheat and corn flowed like gold. They bought tractors and laid more fence line. They took out loans to buy more land. Because everyone believed the price of wheat would never crash, the rains would never stop coming. In schoolyards, these same children played marbles under brick walls painted with ads for Coca-Cola and Camel cigarettes. They watched silent movies flicker to life in dark theaters. They peeked into department store windows at mannequins dressed in silk and feathered hats. They memorized the curve of neon signs and the thrill of elevators gliding them upward. But behind the glitter, deep down in the soil and behind the vault doors, something fragile rattled. Farms were stretched thin. Banks lent recklessly. Factories built more radios, more cars, more everything than people could really afford. And the richest of the rich danced on skyscraper rooftops as if gravity itself had been repealed. Those children of the Roaring Twenties could not know that a cold wind was already whistling through the cracks, that when the party ended, they would trade their shiny new shoes for hand-me-downs with cardboard soles. That, for some of them, Christmas presents would be an orange and a handful of nuts if they were lucky. That fathers would vanish for weeks to ride the rails in search of work, that mothers would water down soup and smile through tears. But for now, in these bright, reckless years, they were just children chasing ice trucks down dusty alleys, eating nickel candy bars, and sleeping in warm beds under roofs they never imagined could be taken away. These children, the children of the boom, would become the men and women who weathered the bust. They would learn the cost of dreams built on sand, and they would carry that lesson like a hidden scar, teaching it to their own children long after the Roaring Twenties fell silent. The crash, the day the music died, the Duke of New York, somber, measured like reading headlines from an old newspaper by flickering lamplight. And so, my friends, we come to the day when the bright lights of the Jazz Age flickered, then died with a sickening crack. It did not happen all at once, though October 29th, 1929 would be the day etched in America's bones like a date of mourning. Black Tuesday. The warning signs had been there, whispering behind the ticker tape and champagne flutes. Stocks that soared on rumor and hope, not on worth. Banks lending dollars they didn't really have. Everyday folks buying stock on margin, a polite phrase meaning you owned a piece of paper and a whole lot of debt. For a while, it all worked, until it didn't. In the final weeks of October, the house of cards began to tremble. The stock market, once a ticker tape parade of wealth, began to shudder downward. A few traders tried to sell, then a few more. Panic spread like a fire in a dry wheat field. On Black Thursday, October 24th, the first wave hit. Brokers shouted. Papers fluttered down from gallery railings onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange like confetti at a funeral. Banks scrambled to calm their customers. Rich men pooled money to stop the slide. But fear, once loose, is a hard horse to catch. And so, on Tuesday the 29th, the dam finally burst. $10 billion in wealth, gone in a day. Fortunes that had taken a lifetime to build vanished between morning coffee and evening bourbon. Ticker tape machines ran hours behind, spewing out bad news no one could stop. Outside Wall Street, crowds gathered, men in bowler hats and newsboys on tiptoes, straining to glimpse the panic through the tall windows. Inside, traders wept and screamed. Rumors flew of bankers throwing themselves from high ledges, a grim legend partly true, partly myth, but true enough in spirit. And beyond the towers of New York, the shockwave rolled on rails and dirt roads to every corner of America. Banks, already shaky, closed their doors. Families lost life savings overnight. Farmers who once bought shiny tractors on credit now watched the bankman tack foreclosure notices to their barns. Shops emptied. Factories slowed, then went dark. In a single season, what had felt like an endless upward climb turned into a sheer cliff. 1 in 4 American workers would soon be out of work. Breadlines stretched around corners. Men who once sold stocks now sold apples on street corners for a nickel. Children once so full of the Jazz Age's promise now went to bed with growling stomachs. But it was more than money that cracked. It was trust, faith in the system, faith that banks were safe, that jobs were steady, that the dream, if you just worked hard enough, would always hold you up. And so the music died. The brass bands fell silent. The champagne glasses went dry. The Roaring Twenties slipped away into the history books, and a new word replaced the roar: depression. Heavy, gray, a word that tasted like coal dust and stale bread. Yet for all its cruelty, the crash was only the beginning. It turned fear into fact. It made clear that what breaks Wall Street breaks Main Street too. And it forced a generation to ask, how do you rebuild when the roof caves in on everyone at once? Tonight, my friends, that is where our story heads next. Into breadlines and Dust Bowl wins, the promises of leaders, the songs of hobos riding the rails, and the iron backbone of everyday folk who kept the lights burning, however dim, until hope returned. So the markets fell, the banks closed, the fields cracked, and yet life went on. It always does. But in those long years, life was different. Life was survival, holding on by a thread and hoping that thread didn't snap when the wind howled at the door. Across America, millions of families who once thought themselves safe, the comfortable clerks, the proud factory foremen, the shopkeepers with tidy ledgers, found themselves stripped bare alongside those who'd never had much to begin with. It was the age of breadlines, hungry men and women standing in the cold for a ladle of soup, a crust of bread. Lines so long they bent around city blocks, quiet except for the shuffling of feet and the cough of winter air in hollow chests. It was the age of lost farms. In the Great Plains, soil that had once grown golden wheat turned to powder. Years of deep plowing, meant to feed booming cities, left the land naked. When the rains stopped and the winds came, they picked up that earth and carried it in great black clouds that blotted out the sun. The Dust Bowl, they called it. And no name could better fit that gritty, choking plague. Families stuffed wet rags under doors. They hung damp sheets in windows. Mothers wiped layers of dust from sleeping children's faces, and still it sifted in, a reminder that the land could betray you too. In cities, fathers pounded the pavement in worn-out shoes, knocking on factory gates that had no work to give. Some packed a bundle and rode the rails, joining an army of drifters called hobos. Men and boys who clung to freight cars under the moon, trading rumors of work like scraps of bread. In towns and backyards, mothers learned to make supper from next to nothing, stretching beans, flour, and cheap cuts of meat into stews that could feed 5 mouths instead of 3. They mended the same shirts and patched the same overalls until the fabric could take no more. They made do, because there was no other choice. Children grew up fast. They shined shoes, hawked papers, helped carry the burden in ways no school ever taught them. They learned that an orange in the toe of a Christmas stocking was a treasure, not a given. They learned to hush their stomachs when the pantry was empty. They learned to stand proud in hand-me-downs and not show the holes in their shoes. Communities bent, but somehow did not break. Neighbors pooled what they could. Churches, charities, soup kitchens, all strained to fill the gaps left by banks that had vanished like smoke. Sometimes it was enough, sometimes it wasn't. And yet, through that long, gray stretch of years, a stubborn flame kept burning. People sang. People danced. Cheap dance marathons that went on for days, desperate to win a little prize money. People packed tiny movie houses to watch Fred Astaire tap dance in top hats and tails. A dream world where nobody went hungry, where depression couldn't reach. They listened to the radio, the crackle and hum of Roosevelt's voice promising a new deal from fireside chats. They found hope in talk of work relief and alphabet agencies, the WPA, the CCC, gangs of young men planting trees, building roads, earning a few precious dollars to send home. Holding on by a thread, that's what it was. And yet that thread, frayed though it was, held more than families together. It bound a nation. It wove a stubborn belief that somehow, some way, tomorrow might just be kinder than today. So as you sit here with me tonight, picture those millions. Fathers with calloused hands, mothers stirring thin soup, kids barefoot on cracked porches. They did not know what tomorrow held, but they rose with the sun and faced it anyway. And in that, my friends, they taught the world something priceless. That hope, though it bends under weight, rarely breaks. When the banks fell silent and the soup lines grew, when farmers packed up wagons for anywhere but here, Americans looked for someone, anyone, who might know how to stitch the broken world back together. They first turned to a man named Herbert Hoover. Hoover was no villain, though history has not been kind to his name. A self-made man, an engineer by training, Hoover had fed starving Europe after the Great War, a man once nicknamed the Great Humanitarian. He believed in thrift, charity, local aid, in neighbors helping neighbors, communities standing strong without the heavy hand of government telling them how. When the stock market cracked and the economy began its long slide, Hoover asked business leaders to hold wages steady, local charities to feed the hungry local banks to steady the ship. But charity soup could not fill every empty belly. The private donations dried up like the Oklahoma topsoil. For millions, Hoover's brand of self-reliance sounded like a door slammed shut. Hoover's face became a symbol, for many, not of rescue, but of helplessness. Homeless camps sprang up in city parks and under bridges, christened Hoovervilles by bitter tongues. A newspaper used as a blanket became a Hoover blanket. Empty pockets turned inside out were called Hoover flags. It was cruel shorthand, but in desperate times, people looked for names to pin blame on. And so, when the election of 1932 came rolling like a restless storm, the nation turned its eyes to a man in a pince-nez and a broad grin, a man who carried his own burden, polio, yet seemed to stand taller than any tower. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR came with a new tone, a new word, hope. He promised not vague charity, but a new deal. He spoke on the radio, his famous fireside chats, as if he sat right there with you, your neighbor in the living room, while you stirred watery soup over the stove. The New Deal was not one thing, but many things all at once. It was public works that built roads and schools. It was the Civilian Conservation Corps, young men planting trees, fighting erosion, building trails in national parks. It was the Works Progress Administration, artists painting murals, writers collecting the songs and stories of America's forgotten corners. It was the Social Security Act, a promise that old age would not always mean poverty, that widows and orphans might have something to stand on. It was regulation of banks, FDIC stickers promising that your life savings would not vanish overnight again. To some, Roosevelt was a traitor to his class, an aristocrat who dared to side with the hungry and the poor instead of the bankers and the barons. To others, he was the first real friend they'd ever felt in the White House. He smiled from newspapers, his cigarette holder at a jaunty angle. He radiated energy when the country felt drained of it. Did the New Deal fix everything? No. Unemployment lingered, some programs stumbled, some people fell through the cracks, critics howled about government overreach, the Supreme Court struck down parts of it. But for millions, the New Deal was more than a plan. It was a promise that they were not alone, that Washington would put its hand on the wheel, not just preach self-reliance while barns were being boarded up. Hoover faded into quiet retirement, a man who lived long enough to see his reputation soften when later crises needed his steady mind. Roosevelt, meanwhile, became the face not just of recovery but of resilience. He steered the country through the Depression's deepest years. And then, when the world went to war, he rose again to lead it through the thunder of tanks and bombers. Together, Hoover and Roosevelt mark two ends of a lesson, that leadership is not just policy, it is timing, vision, faith, and a willingness to carry the weight of other people's burdens on your own shoulders, for better or worse. And so when we remember the Great Depression, we do not just remember dusty fields and breadlines. We remember the faces of the leaders who stood at the helm, trying to keep a listing ship afloat through waters no one alive had ever dared to cross before. When the worst of the storms had blown themselves out, when the banks reopened, shortened, when factories rattled back to life under the hammer of war production, the Great Depression did not simply vanish like a bad dream at sunrise. It stayed. It stayed in the cupboards people still stocked too well, just in case. It stayed in the crumpled paper bag folded and refolded until the corners went soft. It stayed in the habit of saving buttons, of never throwing away a piece of string that might one day be useful. An entire generation carried the shadows of those lean years like an invisible satchel strapped across their backs. The children of the Great Depression grew into the soldiers and nurses of World War II, men and women who had already known want and sacrifice long before ration cards and blackout curtains. They took the habits of thrift, hard work, and quiet stoicism with them into the factories that churned out tanks and bombers, into the fields that fed armies half a world away. When the war ended, they came home, and they built. Oh, how they built. Suburbs sprang up on farmland. Highways knotted the nation together in concrete ribbons. Colleges filled with students, many of them veterans, eager to learn, to rise, to secure the future they'd seen vanish once before. But beneath the boom years of the 1950s and the neon promise of post-war America, the old ghosts never fully left. They shaped policy and politics, Social Security, unemployment insurance, deposit guarantees. These were not just abstract lines in law books, but living memories carved by the fear of breadlines and closed banks. The scars of the Depression lingered too, in what people feared most. To this day, we watch the stock market's heartbeat with the memory of that 1929 crash flickering in the background. Economists study the Great Depression like doctors studying a nearly fatal illness, hoping that if they understand it deeply enough, they can keep the patient, the economy, from ever falling that sick again. And yet, the Depression left behind more than just fear. It left behind a belief in resilience, that a nation could bend but not break, that communities, even when battered by drought and debt and dust storms, would find ways to share soup, to patch clothes, to lift each other over the hardest years. It left behind folk songs and photographs that still catch the eye and clench the heart. Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, her eyes staring past the lens, looking for a future she wasn't sure would come. It left behind caution, but also a fierce hope that such days could be beaten back by courage, by neighbors, by leaders who would not look away when the bread ran out. And perhaps, most hauntingly of all, it left behind questions we still whisper today. Could it happen again? Are we wiser now? Or are we just as blind, just as confident in booms that grow too wild, just as vulnerable when the winds shift? These questions echo every time a stock ticker dips too low, every time a bank falters, every time the headlines rumble with fears of recession and unemployment. Because that's the thing about the Great Depression. It is both past and warning. It is a chapter closed in dusty books and a cautionary tale that lives in the back of every mind that knows how fragile plenty can be. It shaped a generation. It shaped the laws they passed, the communities they built, the dreams they dared trust again, and it still shapes us, whether we know it or not. So the next time you drop a few coins in a jar marked rainy day, remember, that phrase was once literal. When the rain never came, when the crops failed, when the rain did come and washed away everything left standing. Remember the scars, remember the lessons, and remember the millions who found ways to stand up again when it felt like the whole world had fallen down. So here we stand, my friends, in the long shadow of breadlines and boarded up banks, in the wind that still sometimes rustles through abandoned farmhouses on the edge of the Dust Bowl. We stand among ghosts who do not haunt with chains or cries, but with warnings and whispered wisdom. The Great Depression was not just a decade of numbers and ledgers or grainy black and white photographs of hollow-eyed children. It was a test, a trial by hunger and fear. And it revealed just how brittle our big promises can be when greed runs wild and safety nets snap under the weight of sudden collapse. It revealed, too, the stubborn courage hidden in the marrow of everyday people, factory workers who lined up day after day for jobs that never came, mothers who stretched flour and hope into biscuits that somehow fed 5 mouths, fathers who rode the rails or walked highways with battered suitcases looking for work where there was none to find, children who grew up too fast with grown-up worries shadowing their play. It showed us the best and worst of what people can be. Neighbors who opened kitchens for strangers, bankers who turned blind eyes to ruin until the roof fell in on everyone, politicians who fumbled and flailed, then found a way, sometimes, to steer the nation back towards steadier ground. And maybe most of all, it showed us that every golden age can break, that every bubble can burst, and that every time we stand on the edge of a boom, we must ask ourselves, what happens when the music stops? Who gets left holding the empty bag? We live now in a time that feels, in some ways, so distant from those dusty roads and shuttered factories, yet the echoes are never far. Recessions rumble, markets tremble. Headlines remind us that even the strongest towers can sway when the winds of panic blow through Wall Street. So we study this story, not to scold ourselves into fear, but to remind ourselves that what matters most when the world turns cruel is not gold or stocks or boardroom deals, but people, community, the neighbor who shares half a loaf, the leaders who dare to try something new, the builders who rise when the dust settles and say, never again, and mean it. So tonight, when you turn off this story, when you set down your cup, maybe glance in the cupboard and think of the families who opened theirs and found only empty shelves. Maybe remember how easy it is to forget and how important it is not to. And if you ever find yourself in hard times, and we all do in our own ways, remember those who came before. They remind us that a bad year or even a bad decade cannot crush the stubborn, roaring, unyielding spirit that keeps us moving forward, one worn boot step at a time. So here's to the children of the Great Depression, to the mothers with flour-dusted aprons, to the men who built the roads, the dams, the bridges, to the voices on the radio that promised tomorrow could be better than today. We stand on the roads they paved, and we owe them not to forget. I am the Duke of New York, and this has been Faces of History. Thank you for listening. Keep the lights on, keep the pantry stocked, and keep the stories alive, because the past is never as far away as we like to think. Good night, my friends. Until next time.